My name is Emily Rose, and today I will be discussing the topic of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in military members with a specific focus on the emotional impact on the spouse. When researching this topic, my chief goal was to understand both how and why PTSD affects military spouses. Because military spouses are the primary source of care for the military members, they are necessarily impacted by the spouse. And I find that this area of research is so important because the occurrence of PTSD is so common. So as a military spouse myself, I felt that it was important that I seek to better understand both how PTSD changes the military member and its behavioral manifestations, and importantly, how those changes affect the spouse. So to accomplish my goal, I conducted a literature review of previously conducted reputable research. In the course of my own research, I did encounter some difficulties in locating and examining the emotional impact of PTSD on the spouse. But this only served to further emphasize the importance of research on this topic. So to overcome this challenge, I chose to narrow my search a bit. And in doing so, I chose to search for very specific terms like perceived burden in military spouses. And although the articles that I was able to find using this search, although they did not pertain exclusively to PTSD, they provided key insights to the effect on the spouse. So when I began my research, I wanted to first establish a solid understanding of how PTSD changes the military members. So in doing this, my thought was that I would be able to gain a deeper appreciation for how the spouses are affected and why. So because PTSD is a well-studied disorder, I was able to determine from several sources both the neural and behavioral changes that occur in military members who are suffering from PTSD. For example, in a study conducted in 2007 by Etkin and Wager, it was discovered that there was hypoactivation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this area of the brain is critical for emotion regulation. So hypoactivation in this area, or slowed activation, could help to explain why the military members who have PTSD have such difficulty with regulating their emotions. Etkin and Wager also found hyperactivation in the amygdala, and this area of the brain is critical for emotion response. So hyperactivation and increased activation could help to explain why the military members who suffer from PTSD have an inappropriate response to the emotions that they feel. So these results, considering these neural changes that occur in these key areas of the brain for processing emotion, these results help to explain those behavioral changes that occur in the military members, like mood swings and apathy and fear and anger. So these hallmark symptoms that appear in PTSD can actually be attributed to those the altered brain chemistry. In another reputable study that was conducted in 2004, Monson, Price, Rodriguez, Ripley, and Warner specifically considered how PTSD affects the military members emotionally. So not how they affected the spouses, but how these changes affected the military members. And what they found was that the military members who suffered from PTSD exhibited symptoms of depression, but also symptoms of alexithymia, which is the inability to adequately express one's own emotions. So this could indicate that the military members have a difficult time communicating with their spouses about what they're feeling. So so with this understanding of how PTSD affects the military members, all of these changes, the anger, the apathy, the aggression, the mood swings, the alexithymia, I wanted to then understand how those changes affected the spouse. So with regard to a general emotional impact, DeBerg, White, Fear, and Iverson conducted a literature review in 2011, and they found that spouses of military members with PTSD experienced psychological disturbances as a result of the disorder. And additionally, they noted a negative impact on the marriage relationship, with communication and bonding being particularly affected as a consequence of the disorder. So other research has also found that spouses of military members with PTSD actually experience what is called secondary PTSD. So Nelson and Wright found that in 2011 found that the symptoms that the military spouses exhibit actually mirror the symptoms that the military members experience. So this means that spouses experience symptoms of fear, apathy, and depression just the way that the military members do. And importantly, the spouse's perspective has also been studied with a specific focus on the spouse's perceived burdens that are associated with the military member's PTSD. Notably, in 2011, Koska and Renshaw discovered that the spouses felt that they were unable to adequately cope with the burdens that were caused by the PTSD, and their confidence in themselves and their confidence in their own abilities diminished as a result of this PTSD. Further, in 2009, Outram, Hansen, McDonald, Cockburn, and Adams found that the spouses felt as though their military members, although present, were absent. That is, they felt as though their military members were living in this constant state of mental war. And so they felt that their military members were not really there, and they struggled to readjust to normal life at home. And so as a result of this, the military spouses experienced symptoms of depression, anxiety, and importantly, a struggle to understand what had happened to their military member. And this was an important finding to me. I wanted to further understand or explore how the spouses understand PTSD. And in doing so, I found a study conducted in 2011 by Buchanan, Smith, McCain, and Cox. And they specifically studied the spouse's understanding of PTSD, or whether or not the spouses had received a formal education of the disorder. And what they found is that many of the spouses had not received a formal education, and that they were, in fact, undereducated and thus improperly prepared to cope with or handle their loved one's PTSD. So with this knowledge, I was thinking about how, while there is necessarily great attention that is dedicated to the treatment of PTSD for the military members, I felt that it was also critical to explore various treatments for the spouses, given the severity of the emotional impact that they experience as a result of living with someone with PTSD. So notably, researchers have found that spouses benefit from therapy and support groups. Specifically, Nelson and Wright concluded positive results from concurrent couples therapy and individual therapy. That is, couples therapy would serve as a way to increase the communication between the spouse and the military member, and thus improve their relationship. And the individual therapy would help to address the stressors that the spouse experiences independently, and how the spouse can cope with their own pain and suffering. Similarly, Outram et al. found positive results from support groups, and this was because in those support groups, the spouses were able to bond over their shared pain, and they could discover more appropriate coping methods to address the stress that they experience and the burdens that they experience as a result of the military members' PTSD. Further, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which is also known as the VA, they found that calming techniques such as meditation or any sort of actions that can increase relaxation, like exercise, for example, could help to alleviate symptoms of stress that are related to the military lifestyle. And importantly, they stressed the fact that the caregiver, the military spouse, their health and well-being is critical for the adequate care of the military member. That is, the military spouse must be in good health, must care for him or herself in order to appropriately care for his or her military member. So to conclude, it is clear that PTSD is a debilitating disorder with far-reaching consequences not only on the military member, but on the spouse as well. The neural changes affecting both emotion regulation and response explain the aggression, fear, and apathy exhibited by the military member. And these behavioral changes in the member lead to significant emotional consequences for the spouse, including stress, depression, anxiety, and even abuse. The health and well-being of the spouse is critical for the care of the military member, yet it is clear that the spouses are undereducated and thus incapable of adequately coping with the PTSD and managing the care for the military member. So an increased focus on the necessity of formal education of PTSD would help the spouses to better cope with the PTSD and appropriately care for the military member. Most importantly, support groups are necessary for the spouses as an outlet for their pain and suffering. It is necessary then that greater research be conducted to understand not only the emotional impact of PTSD on military spouses, but also effective treatments for them. Thank you.